Just a reminder that after our next talk, there will be a reception afterwards, so all the presenters will be here if you come up with another last-minute question or just want to say hello and like that. So there'll be a little reception with wine after our next presentation. I'm tasked with introducing Benjamin Buchloh, who you already know. Everybody, I would assume, knows Benjamin Buchloh, certainly the leading critic of post-war European and American art. Always challenging and always an authority who you need to consult if you're interested in, in the subject of contemporary art and its political and ethical dimensions. So it's a real honor and a privilege to introduce him. You certainly know his work. He's the technically, the formal thing to say would be he's the Andrew Mellon Professor of Art History at Harvard. It's a really treat for having him here. Probably the biggest marker of his also presence is that, if you've been here all day, you've heard the importance and the crucial nature to all the presenters in their talks. So it's a real honor and privilege to welcome you to our keynote speaker, Benjamin H.D. Buchloh.
Thank you, Stephen, for the nice words, but thank you to the Nasher family for inviting us all and not only giving the prize to, in our mind, or many of ours here, an amazing figure in the history of sculpture, but also, which I think is quite remarkable, for organizing a symposium around the prize winner. And that I've never heard of, and it's quite a wonderful invention to do this, and I think it's great to bring a number of younger scholars into the focus, so this is a particularly great advantage of being here in the company of young scholars who write about the work. I also thank Jeremy Strick for having us here, and Dr. Lee Arnold for having organized all of this in the most impeccable way. I should give a trigger warning. We art historians don't have many opportunities to speak like this, but if the artist gives the work a title such as "Fuck the Bauhaus," we are forced to cite it a few times, so I will have to do that. Here is Isa Genzken's self-portrait called My Brain. It's a work that demarcates the transition from the early work, about which we have heard quite wonderful observations this morning, to the second phase of her work, the concrete sculptures. And I'm showing it in lieu of another work, which I unfortunately cannot reproduce because it doesn't exist anymore, called Kürtchen. Kürtchen meaning the diminutive of a German first name Kurt, and I will talk about this in a moment, who this Kurt is. So My Brain is, of course, a wonderful object that still exists. It has both the disintegration and the amorphous, formless materiality of the work that is to follow, but it also has already anticipating the nevertheless upright utopian aspiration that the world receivers, for example, will formulate in this otherwise rather frightful diminution of the subject. Isa Genzken's most famous, if notorious, title, and undoubtedly one of her most stringent groups of sculptures in the second half of her multifarious career, is called Fuck the Bauhaus. And we have read precise, complex, and compelling interpretations of this series in the writings of Laura Hopman or Lisa Lee, among others. Nevertheless, I will start my paper today with an attempt to shift this title into a slightly different historical perspective, not to contest the previous readings, but to complement them with a historical dimension that proves that the clarion call to fuck the Bauhaus was in fact voiced as early as the foundation of the Bauhaus itself by artists who were profoundly skeptical of the utopian Bauhaus promises, right from the start in 1919. And I will claim that these are in fact some of the major historical precursors of the radically anti-utopian, the melancholic mentality that has defined the second phase of Isa Genzken's oeuvre since the early 1990s. I'm showing you, of course, Lionel Feininger's woodcut that accompanied Gropius's manifesto of the Bauhaus in 1919, the Cathedral. And then there is the second phase of an opposition to the Bauhaus, which I will also very briefly sketch out, from within the very ranks of the Bauhaus masters. And while there are many examples where all principles of Bauhaus ethics and aesthetics were betrayed by the Bauhaus figures themselves, I will only point to one very prominent one that for some reason had a tremendous attraction to Genzken during her regular visits and sojourns in New York, namely Gropius's architectural masterpiece, the Pan Am Building. But before I go there, I want to show you why Kürtchen is important. This is Kurt Schwitters's manifesto, manuscript, or pamphlet, or small portfolio of prints, called The Cathedral, published immediately after 1919. And you can see in the wonderful design in the middle left what he thought what the cathedral should look like, right? So quite clearly, in Schwitters's vision, an opposition to the concept of a utopian architecture that would transform society was met with the greatest skepticism immediately. And here, also in 1919, at the very moment, Schwitters forms the first column that will become eventually the Märzbau. It's actually called the März column, which incorporates not only the death mask of his recently deceased first son, but it also incorporates, as you can see, a number of papers, newspapers, daily pamphlets at the bottom of the column itself, inasmuch as it is also, and this is important, a model of sculpture as a column, which will be important later on in development of Genzken's focus on the column as well. The column is, of course, neither architecture nor sculpture, and Schwitters's conception of sculpture as in between everything, he actually called all of the elements of the Märzbau columns, is clearly articulated here. This is, for those of you who might not have seen this in a while, of course, one of the final phases of the Märzbau as it was finished in the years from 1919 to 1926 or even later. And a third example from that first initial opposition to the Bauhaus we can see in 1920 in the Dada Messe in Berlin in the work by Johannes Baader. And as you can see, once again, not only is this a column or a structure or a monument or an undefinable sculpture, because it is completely constituted by mass cultural pamphlets and mass cultural papers, but it is also already incorporating the mannequin, the show window mannequin, as one of its integral elements that confronts us with the question of what is the ready-made when it becomes a figure, which is one of the key questions with which I will engage in the second part of this paper. And lastly, from the same exhibition, again, a very important example of where mass culture effaces anthropomorphic identity or physiognomic identity, which is one of the key confrontations at that time, Raoul Hausmann's 1920 Spirit of the Time. And lastly, equally from that exhibition, 1920, once again, John Hartfield and George Gross's portrait of the wild Philistine or Spießbürger Hartfield, in a clear citation of numerous traumatic conditions of experience, namely the cripple, the prosthetic, and the totally de-individuated subject of post-World War I individuality. So the second moment of Fuck the Bauhaus, as I said, emerges from the masters of the Bauhaus themselves. Here we have Walter Gropius, accompanied by Emery Roth, who is the co-architect of the Pan Am building as it was built in 1959 to 1963, accompanied by the Commissioner of the City of New York, Mr. Wolfson, photographed by Andreas Feininger. So we have a Bauhaus group in the most peculiar sense together. Andreas Feininger is, of course, the son of Lionel Feininger. And they're standing in front of the model of the building that was at the time widely perceived as a scandal because it was disrupting the view of Manhattan. It was built over Grand Central Station, and it was widely perceived as a typical monstrosity of modernist architecture. It traversed and it troubled Manhattan. If there ever had been any doubt that the Bauhaus would provide the legitimation for new forms of gigantic corporate architecture that would not just correspond to the ever-expanding demands of late capitalist forms of exploitation of human labor and ecological resources, it would be Gropius's late style and late oeuvre, a quintessential example of architecture exclusively determined to and following economical necessities of profit maximization to the detriment of any concern of urban dwellings, urban communities, or ecologies. So there's an ever greater irony in the fact that Gropius's gesture of solidarity with one of his less fortunate colleagues at the Bauhaus, Joseph Albers, who had emigrated like him to the United States in the first years after the Nazi fascists came to power, commissioned a major glass mural, here it is, commissioned a major glass mural for the Pan Am building. In fact, one of the largest and the most important glassworks that Joseph Albers ever produced. In 2010, the owners of the major building, the Met Life building as it was called, decided to destroy the mural, fuck the Bauhaus, one more time. A work by this artist disappeared completely. It didn't seem appropriate anymore in New York because it really seemed to have outlived its historical promises as a utopian space of democratic egalitarian experience. These are three sketches, or two sketches rather, to be followed by the third one, namely the various stances with which one can look back at the impact of the Bauhaus and understand Genzken's skepticism with regard to that legacy. Quite clearly, the initial stance of Schwitters and the Dada artists is part of her opposition, as much as the recognition that the Bauhaus as a utopian model has failed, so that is not necessarily a polemical position. And lastly, there is a certain degree of critical reflection on the Bauhaus from Genzken's perspective when she famously says, the Bauhaus had to fail because it did not recognize the beauty of flowers. Extraordinary statement, incidentally. So, if the first one, which links Genzken to the artist of the 20th century with whom we would claim she was most deeply bonded, such as Kurt Schwitters, it was precisely Schwitters' inimitable sense of the decay and disqualification of materials as carriers of utopian future social bliss that would be equated with Genzken's rage for the infinity of artificial colors, textures, and surfaces in the second phase of her sculptural production. That is, after the ruinous concrete cast that had already unsettled her early magisterial modernist sculptures. The Modernist Line, which ranged from Brancusi to Judd in her early work, the Modernist Line in which sculpture serves as a metonymy of the subject's spatial and social conditions, which concretizes the subject's groundedness in tactility and phenomenological experience. It offers the subject a model of future possibility, of spatial location, where the subject could relate to morphologies, materials, and masterly perfection as warranties that guarantee the historical presence and accessibility of the subject's groundedness in space. Having written on various occasions on the earlier phases of Genzken's by now astonishingly extensive and extremely diverse sculptural production, it seems plausible. Here is the actual image of the installation of Fuck the Bahaus at AC Space in New York. It seems plausible that I would finally address the more recent work, culminating for the time being in the series of the so-called actors. Prefigurations for these citational figures appear perhaps for the first time with the astronauts in Genzken's installation in the Venice Biennale. Here we go. Since then, Genzken has incorporated an increasing number of mannequin figures in her sculptural constructs, of the type that are usually deployed in common shop window displays. And it was precisely her incorporation of these figures, unlike the work that featured increasingly banal or drastic objects, such as parasols, strollers, or wheelchairs, that challenged my initial comprehension to the degree, when I saw them for the first time, they left me with some serious doubts about the actual status and the possible future reception and place of Genzken's oeuvre within the discursive formation which we call the modernist history of 20th century sculpture. Finally, it was the renewed and more extensive encounter with the actors in her retrospective exhibition at MoMA in New York in 2013 and 14. Here is the entrance to the exhibition. That triggered my admittedly belated understanding of the work, I think. And the realization that this group might in fact be yet another major and fundamentally different yet central complex in Genzken's already extremely heterogeneous oeuvre. Several features of Genzken's apparent variation on the age-old anti-modernist promises of a return to figuration had initially offended me and offended my more or less modernist doxa. First of all, her work seemed gaudy, repulsively vulgar, becoming at the same time, paradoxically, ever more glamorous, and in that manner, even more perplexing than her rather outlandish connections of the wildest possible variety of found objects and material citations. Second, Genzken's figurations appeared to introduce a heretofore almost unthinkable narrative dimension into late 20th and early 21st century sculpture, if not a representational literalism into what had been previously, from Carl Andre to Richard Serra, from Bruce Nauman to Dan Graham, appeared as purely phenomenological reflections of the subject's position and function in public social space. Thirdly, Genzken's actors not only seem to signal a return to figuration, but worse, they appear to have abolished the ready-made, its originary dialectic between subject and object, decisively turning the subject itself into a model of reified objectivity, while displaying a deceptive conflation of the two terms, a false realism, in my mind, as it seemed. It also seemed, and very distressingly so for me, that Genzken's work reached a precarious proximity to a category of anti-modernist figurative sculpture, which had emerged more or less at the same period, slightly earlier, in work such as the work of Charles Ray or Jeff Koons. Or worse yet for me, in work such as socialist realist artists such as Duane Hanson. These had not exactly been among the model figures of in my sculptural pantheon. After all, Genzken herself had always prided herself in her relationship to the work of Bruce Nauman, Dan Graham, and Lawrence Weiner. But most problematical of all was perhaps the fact that her work, once it had become figurative, inevitably confronted us with a crucial historical and theoretical question. How could the former radicality of a ready-made aesthetic that had ruled Genzken's work now accommodate a shift into figurative representation? To answer this question, we will have to clarify some of the deeper implications of the contradictions between the episteme of the ready-made and that of the anthropomorphic figure. And inevitably, we will have to reflect on some earlier moments in sculptural history where comparable confrontation between the ready-made object and figuration might have occurred, such as here in the exhibition that was curated by André Breton and Marcel Duchamp in 1938 in Paris. Thus, I will briefly sketch out some scenes from the long and complex history in 20th century art where the dialectics of ready-made and figuration had become articulated. To my knowledge, very few, if any, comments have recognized that the discovery of Giorgio de Chirico and his preoccupation with the mannequin, the manichino, in all of its forms from studio prop to exhibition object, and Marcel Duchamp's urinal are made in the same year. The fountain dates from 1917, as does the de Chirico that I just showed. And while the deeper connections that link these two foundational epistemes of modernism and anti-modernism in the 20th century might yet have to be explored, we can hypothetically state, at least for the purposes of this lecture, that a deeply dialectical bond linked these supposedly incompatible models to begin with. I can only give the crudest sketch of how these historical oppositions played out in the history following de Chirico and Duchamp's initial definition. As is well known, the early impact of de Chirico on German artists of the post-World War generation was immense, quite unlike the relative, if not total, absence of an impact of the Duchampian ready-made, which nobody in Germany seemed to have understood at the time. Therefore, it might be worthwhile to start by briefly recounting the various models of the German de Chirico reception, which were as fundamentally different from each other as from de Chirico's original manichino itself. De Chirico's mannequins, originally derived from the shop window figure, the tailor's dummy, and the studio model, would generate an enormously complex program and progeny in the German reception, specifically in the process of de Chirico reception in Berlin Dada. It would be reconfigured in particular in post-World War I German preoccupations as the figure of the cripple, of the prosthetic subject, as much as within the increasingly apt image of the new man as a robot, as an automaton under the advanced forms of capitalism. And if de Chirico's figurines had originated in a possibly reactionary response to the radicality of Cubism's deconstruction of the human figure, his mannequins only deplored painting's putative foundations in mimetic figuration. But they also mourned the disappearance of painting's historical capacity to depict the human subject altogether. Thus, de Chirico's proposition to mourn the loss of figurative representation triggered this new and contradictory spectrum of substitutional figures in various subsequent cultural contexts. And a third paradoxically different response to de Chirico's mannequin would be gender-specific. And it would become increasingly prominent in the subsequent development, namely the reading of the studio figure or the tailor's dummy, which would now return as the Dada doll in the work of Hannah Hösch, for example. Thus, even if relatively disregarded for the longest time, these hybrids of what we would call an anthropomorphic ready-made had a particular history, paradoxically even a specifically German history, before it might have become a French or even a universal history. And that history obviously culminated in 1920 at the Dada Fair, as I have shown in the beginning. All of these citations formed the first truly mixed media sculptures of the 20th century, or as we would argue, they embodied the first successful fusion of a return to figuration and the ready-made, which would obviously become a complex system of future references unacknowledged until recently and only evident in the work of Genzken in the most programmatic way. So we would have to situate Genzken's actors on a fundamentally different historical stage, obviously, utterly new and incomparable to these historical predecessors. And even we could convincingly argue that a link between the two formations exists, we would still have to distinguish these figures, separated by almost 100 years. And we would have to answer whether it is the dimension of the robotic, the dimension of the traumatic, the dimension of feminist derision, or a totally different dimension that drives Genzken's actors to wear what they wear and to find themselves compounded in these uncanny collectives on the stage of the museum. And if we actually could establish such a productive comparison and differentiation between the legacies of German Dada and Genzken's new figurations, an even more difficult question would have to be asked, namely, whether and to what extent is Genzken's return to figuration, if that is in fact what we are confronting, consciously or unconsciously, unknowingly, taking part in the historical and critical attempt to refigure the subject, to refigure the subject-object relationship according to the principles of a fusion of de Chirico and Duchamp. Among the sheer infinity of the experiential and perceptual conditions that Marcel Duchamp's classical ready-made would address in 1917, one was the condition of inextricable desubjectivization, the anonymity of production, and the reception that focused on collectively produced industrial objects. This had been foundational. Inevitably, therefore, the anti-aesthetic of the ready-made had from the very beginning reflected, let me go back, had from the very beginning reflected critically on the existential and perceptual conditions of collective reification and alienation. Mimetically assimilating itself to these conditions, the ready-made aesthetic had addressed them both on the level of artistic production as much as on the level of aesthetic reception. Duchamp's metonymy of the particular object had perhaps been one of the ready-made's most important features, since in an exemplary aesthetic dialectic, it had precisely articulated the very condition of the subject's dual deprivation. From the perspective of an alienated industrial producer, the subject found itself deprived from a self-determining productivity. From the perspective of an alienated consumer, the subject found itself deprived from the gratifying object experience delivered by traditional forms of individual artistic production. By contrast, in the subsequent development, with the processes of consumption having reached by the late 1920s an initial proto-totalitarian dimension, the minimum of critical distance that the Duchampian insistence on the metonymic character of the ready-made had still attempted to sustain had been destroyed. And we will witness the emergence of what we would now call the first instances of the ready-made figuration with the acceleration of an exclusively consumption-oriented cultural economy, a collective condition vastly intensified with the arrival of the post-World War II regimes. That dialectic between subject and object could no longer be maintained. But it was already clearly anticipated in Duchamp's exhibition in 1938. Therefore, from now on, to trace the expansion of a totally reified subjectivity meant that the ready-made had to encompass the actual human figure as well as reification itself. Reification had to become figuration, precisely human figuration, precisely the episteme of the socially induced self-constitution of subjectivity. Duchamp's insertion of Man Ray's portrait of his alter ego in Rose C'est la Vie in 1921 would only be the beginning of that tendency. Sorry. Yet this historical dialectic would obviously culminate only quite a bit later in Duchamp's somewhat belated adaptation of the Quirico's mannequins in the design for the Exposition Surréaliste in Paris in 1938. Both his own self-portrait as an androgynous model actor, as well the instruction to his fellows artists to design their own individual grotesque models displaying the conditions of desire under advanced conditions of enforced consumption. If Duchamp and his surrealist cohorts under his instruction had initiated in the passageway, it's a street that they construct, had initiated a new sculptural paradigm of materials and of sculptural reflection and production in 1938, we could call it the Detritus principle of sculpture. There was a beautiful term this morning which was identifying Genzken as the sculptor of calamity and catastrophe. I thought that was quite accurate too. Fashion culture's perpetual principle of forced and planned obsolescence is also the very principle that by now has become the principle of Genzken's fundamental transformation of sculptural materials. After all, her trajectory tells us quite a bit about these dramatic changes that her work has performed over the past 40 years, and one would have to be very naive to assume that these changes are deliberate or dependent on the whim and desire of the artist to alter the pursuits of her oeuvre and projects at large. Clearly, quite the opposite is true. The choices of increasingly dismissing the traditional sculptural materials and morphologies from her practice to such an extent that the work almost seemed to become illegible, if not outright unpalatable for most of her former admiring spectators like myself. It is undoubtedly speaks for the inevitability of these changes and the power of externally determining factors. If in the earlier Duchampian ready-made subject and object could still be distinguished in a situation in which the manufactured world had increasingly displaced the residual spaces of the subject self-determination, let alone the remnants of the public spaces of a former bourgeois autonomy, this dialectical dimension had disappeared by now. What would take its place would be the travesties of the universal reign of the fashion industry as the emerging domain where commodity production, socially produced regimes of compulsive distinction, and regulated narcissism would now rule in all matters of subject formation. And the final erosion of traditional models of bourgeois subjectivity would be induced for the purposes of ever more advancing and ever more invasive forms of substituting the constitution of the subject according to the principles of the acquisition of the fashion object. Thus, we could argue that the human figure reinserts itself within the aesthetics of the ready-made in Genzken's work, when the subject itself has acquired all the features of a fully reified figure. It seems to be at that moment in history, as we can currently recognize once more, when the sense that even within the aesthetic structure, with ever-intensifying totality, the minimal differences have been collapsed or erased. Those differences that had heretofore still distinguished the artistic object from the fashion object, that had separated the phenomenology of perception from the phenomenology of possession and acquisition, that had differentiated the materiality of critical opposition from a material of blind and bland, random and perpetual exchangeability. Could we thus say that the ready-made as figuration in Genzken's work emerges at the very moment when it becomes compellingly evident that the aspirations for the subject-object relationship to sustain a dialectical opposition are no longer tenable? At that moment, when it has become obvious that the conditions of total reification have encroached onto the former concept of a subjective autonomy in aesthetic terms, to such an extent that there is no longer any deception possible which would claim that there are still social and subjective spaces where residual forms of aesthetic autonomy can be experienced. And would we not have to recognize that Genzken's work entered precisely those spaces, initiating the process that has now culminated with a series of actors? For the time being, the last and most recent break in Genzken's eternally breaking continuity of artistic and sculptural categories.